I think one of the first things that organizations and managers need to think about is how to attract people who have some connection to the mission or the direction of the organization itself. While hiring conscientious, motivated, able individuals goes a long way, I think there's something that's necessary about having people who connect in a meaningful way with what it is the organization is trying to do. I think that once an organization has the right strategy, understands what it is it's trying to do, and is pulling in the right direction to do that, that the most essential thing to making that happen and making it happen successfully is to have a staff of people who are the right people, who are motivated to be there, who very much believe in the mission and the cause, who feel that they're treated fairly, who feel like they're compensated fairly, who feel like they have the autonomy and the respect that they deserve. I think that combination of pulling in the right direction and having the right people pulling you in that direction makes an organization unstoppable and would make a lot of these intractable common problems that you see in organizations much, much easier to solve. One of my colleagues named Jeff Pfeffer at Stanford University has done an awful lot of work looking at organizations across a number of industries and sectors to identify those that consistently outperform others in their space, to see what is it, if anything, that they're doing differently that would create a pattern across all of these different spaces that we might learn something from. And to your point about transparency, one of the things that he found is that even in organizations and industries where it is highly counternormative to do so, organizations who end up consistently at the top of their space do things like sharing all of the data that they have with all of the employees about what is happening on the financial side, what is happening in terms of performances, numbers, hiring, where there's more transparency around things like pay. There's more compression between the salary of the top dog in the organization and the newest incoming member. And so there are several other pieces that go along with this, but one of the most critical things is treating people as though they have the right to have and can do good things with all of the data that the decision makers in the organization are dealing with. The trust that that engenders and the commitment that that engenders in turn from employees is often hard to overestimate. Well, all the donuts and beer in the world, while being helpful, don't go as far as things like being treated with respect, getting recognition for work that's been done well, and being included in a community of individuals in the organization, and being, I already said this, but recognized for work done well. Many organizations and employers make the mistake, and I think it's a big mistake, that employees are working for money. Of course, employees are working for money. Everybody needs to make a living, so unless someone's an heir or an heiress in your organization, that's always going to be a consideration. But a mistake gets made when that gets conflated with other reasons as being the only reason why people are coming to work. And instead, employers can do themselves and their employees a lot of good by thinking about ways in which they can help employees design their jobs so that they're engaging in those things that they find meaningful, important, fulfilling, and that they're recognized and rewarded for doing those with recognition, with benefits that they're able to get through their growing expertise, so say more authority or clout in the organization. Things like this end up mattering an awful lot more. If you pay and treat your employees as though the only thing they care about is making money, in the long run, the research suggests they will ultimately begin to behave that way. A long while back, I started doing some research on how people make meaning of their work, and in particular, the kinds of relationships people had to the work that they do. And one of the things that I did in this work with several of my colleagues was to consider, is there any value in trying to understand the relationship people have to their jobs as being a job where the primary focus is on making a living? So the job is about a financial exchange with the organization primarily, where you're working to make money, versus seeing the work as a career where instead of working for a financial end, people are primarily focused on things like advancing in the organization or advancing in the occupation that they're in, whether that's in the same organization or moving between organizations, versus seeing the work more as a calling where people are not working for financial gain or for career advancement primarily, but instead are primarily working for the fulfillment and enjoyment that the work itself brings to the individual. So for people who view their work more as a calling, the work really is an end in itself. These are people who, if they hit the lotto, if they did become an heir or heiress, they would try to keep some involvement in the kind of work that they're doing. And one of the things that we found that's quite interesting is that people who view their work more in this way tend to see the work as having a positive impact on the world, even if you or I would be hard-pressed to see how the work is having a positive impact on the rest of society. And what's been interesting is that in all of the occupations we've studied, we find that people tend to see their work in one of these three ways. Of course, you can get combinations of the three. And that people look more similar to each other on the basis of their orientation, of whether they see their work as a job, career, or calling, than they do on the basis of the kind of work they're doing. So for example, if I were to find people who worked, say, in an administrative role and found people with all three of the orientations, which we do, those who see that work as a calling look more similar to people who, say, work in executive positions who see their work as a calling than they would to others who view their work in different ways. So one of the things that's very interesting about for-profit versus nonprofit is that oftentimes, most often, people who are working in the nonprofit space are working there because they see their work as having a positive impact on the world and in making the world a better place in some way. And so in some sense, they are already predisposed to want to see the work that they're doing in terms of being a calling. And for that reason, I would argue that one of the big differences, generally speaking, between people in the private sector and people in the nonprofit sector is that in the nonprofit sector, it's even more essential that managers and organizations understand and provide employees with ways to see the impact that their work is having on the broader world. So whether that is through having contact with the people who are the beneficiaries of their work, which is a whole line of research that one of my colleagues has conducted that shows that being in touch with the recipients of the efforts that you're making in the nonprofit space or even in the for-profit space ends up being enormously meaningful and motivating to employees. Given that nonprofit organizations, again, are primarily set up to have some positive impact on the world through the arts, through healthcare, through whatever it might be, allowing employees to partake as much as possible in the real evidence of the impact that they're having and to feel like they're having impact becomes absolutely essential. That decision about when do you double down on someone and really invest to see if you can make this work versus it's time to just let someone go is a very hard decision. And my advice on this is pretty basic, and that is unless there's a real issue around someone's honesty or conduct in the organization, I think the right answer is to always first double down and see, is there some way to turn this situation around, and to think very carefully as managers about whether the problem or the issue that you're having is one that is more structural or process-based in nature, or is it really something that's inherent to the individual in question. Sometimes, and maybe some of you have experience with this, people are let go of out of their position, and then you bring someone else in and this is going to be better and this person's going to work out, and 6 months or a year later you're in exactly the same position. That's an expensive way to learn that it wasn't really the individual per se, it was something about the process or the structure around them in trying to get the work done in the position. So I think analyzing that and doubling down first is always smart. If that's done and it's obvious at that point then that the person's not working out, I think once you realize that the performance is flagging or failing, it's not getting any better, being very explicit about what kinds of performance changes you need to see and the behaviors that you need to see, and offering support to try to help enable them. If that's not helping, then I think not only does it help the individual in question who's clearly struggling to let them go so they can find another opportunity, it helps the organization an awful lot, because even in a small organization with, say, 4 employees, everyone knows if someone's not carrying their weight and is not up to the task, or is up to the task but has simply decided not to do it. I think especially in small organizations, the effects of that can be toxic, and so I think it's incredibly important to not just ignore a large problem as it's festering, or to try to build structure around it to insulate the organization from it. If you really have tried to double down and support the employee and it's just not working, it is probably to the benefit of the health of the organization to gently allow that person to move on and then go from there. All of my MBAs, in any kind of case where there's a real performance issue, their first answer is just fire the person. They're gone, they're out of here. And teaching the same cases to executives often recognize from the very beginning that this may be the person that is the issue, but it's probably not. Because if they were great when you hired them, and if you hired the right person, you're probably contributing to this in some way that you don't even realize, that maybe there's something structurally wrong with the organization, maybe there's an interdependence that's just not working out, and so you can just switch that up and everything will be fine again, that the answer isn't to go to the attribution of the individual first. To your question and the way that you phrased it, there's a lot hidden in that phrase, substantive progress, right? So on the one hand, we would think about substantive progress being things like meeting payroll, meeting sort of the basic needs of the employees in the organization. Obviously, that is going to be a huge priority because the organization won't exist much longer if those can't be figured out. But going back to something I had mentioned before, that given how important it is for employees to feel like they are valued, included, essential to the direction of the organization, allowing them to help with figuring out how do we solve these problems, allowing them to help with how is it that we can have even more of an impact so that we can make payroll next time. Where do the employees see the opportunities being for generating more revenue for the organization so that it can be afloat in the next quarter or in the next year? Both involves employees, it respects their intelligence. Sometimes, in most cases, I have found the employees know this space sometimes even better than their managers do. And so constructing this more as an opportunity for everyone to pull together and solve the problems that they're facing, as opposed to just holding them as management and trying to keep everyone paid and rewarded and give them the basics, at the end of the day, just leaves the people who are employed by the organization feeling like they're just getting the basics covered. I have spent my post-PhD life in business school contexts at NYU, at Yale, and this year at Wharton. One of the things that most MBA programs have are any number of programs that are geared to getting MBA students in touch with businesses and nonprofits that need partners, that need someone to come in and look at their financials, look at their strategy, look at their marketing plan, and give them advice. The students want to do it because in some sense it's a clinic for them. They get to learn something. The organizations that benefit from this often benefit greatly from having an objective outsider come in and understand and analyze the space and see it with fresh eyes and from a different perspective than they themselves might have done. And so I would encourage, if this is relevant for the organizations out there, that you look into locally in your space what universities and colleges are around that would have programs like this, that for free would partner with your organization, would be enthusiastic to partner with something that is not a typical sort of mom and pop for-profit sort of shop on the corner, but instead to look for a way to contribute to the arts, to our culture, to society through what it is they're learning. I think the more open the organization can be with all of its data, and if it realizes that it doesn't actually know the data that it needs in order to make decisions and be effective, to use the input of these groups to figure out how do you create systems to generate those data so that you can measure particular outcomes that are going to be necessary to understand in order to grow and thrive. I think other things that help these partnerships be more successful is keeping the students who are involved with you in close touch, sharing a lot of information with them, realizing that they are there to help you and not to compete with you, making sure they understand that you are very expert in the space that you're in, and to explain why maybe some of the first ideas they might have might not work, to give them a lot of data on what you've tried and what's happened with those experiments. I think a climate of rich information sharing and trust and trying to build that up in the best way you possibly can would go an awful long way to building these partnerships. I also think that from the point of view of knowing what MBA students tend to spend their time doing in their coursework and their casework and so on, connecting them with an opportunity to see and appreciate art would be something that I think would be highly unique and very valued by these students. And so is there a performance or a rehearsal that they could observe to understand what is it that the organization at its heart is trying to do?